Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. Wanted to give a brief update off topic. Went to the optometrist today. He reported that my right eye is okay, that the area around my eye, which is black and blue, is healing, and so he said I no longer have anything to worry about. It is only a matter of time. Okay, now on to the topic that I wanted to address today, Zionism. I was raised in a Jewish family, an Ashkenazi Jewish family, in New York City. I was born in Manhattan at what is now a non-existent hospital called Doctors Hospital on the Upper East Side. But I grew up in the Bronx in a Jewish neighborhood, in Queens, Bayside, Queens, also in a Jewish neighborhood. And then we migrated, uh, honestly, against my wishes, but I was a kid, so I had no real say in the matter, to Long Island, which was not a Jewish neighborhood, which was a predominantly Roman Catholic neighborhood. Um, but regardless, I went to Hebrew school. I don't really know whether it was reform or conservative. My guess is that it was reform, but I don't really know because the Hebrew school was not connected with a Jewish temple or community center. It was run by Joel Bernstein, who referred to himself as a rabbi, but I don't know if he was actually ordained a rabbi by any particular Jewish movement, but he did call himself that. And his Hebrew school was also in Bayside. In fact, it was in walking distance of my home. I'm also a Brit Milah, which I'm always embarrassed to mention. I don't know why, which is covenants of circumcision. I guess because I come from a non-religious family, talking about covenants of circumcision just sounds odd to me, discussing that particular thing. I suppose if I were from a religious family, it would not matter to me, but that's not the case. So what I wanted to do is to address the subject of Zionism and uh, why it continues to be a controversial issue, including in the Jewish world today. Now, am I still Jewish? That is a debatable point. Um, from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, yes, because my parents, my mother in particular, which really matters, was Jewish. From a Reconstructionist, Reform, and conservative perspective, the answer would be no, uh, because I don't practice Judaism and I actually converted out of Judaism to another religion. So I don't know. But since I am not a member of any Jewish movement, that doesn't really matter to me. I don't really care. Do I consider myself to be Jewish? Well, the answer depends on the context. If you're asking me, am I Jewish in the sense of my ancestry? I would say yes. If you're asking me, am I Jewish in the sense of Yiddishkeit, which basically means engaging in Jewish culture, the answer is no. If you're asking me in the sense of practicing any form of Judaism or engaging in Jewish ritual, again, the answer is no. So it depends on what you mean by asking me the question, are you Jewish? I am by definition Ashkenazi, which refers to the Jews who migrated to northern and central Europe. And so I guess in that sense, I'm Ashkenazi, and Ashkenazi is usually a prefix or an adjective for Jewish, which I don't know if it would apply to me, but I will leave that up to you to decide, not me. As to Zionism, Zionism has had a long and convoluted history. When the idea was first developed in the 1800s, there was no concept of a new Israel being started in Palestine. That was not even considered. The only objective was to establish an Israel. Theoretically, it could have been anywhere. Muammar Gaddafi, a man whom I have a tremendous amount of respect for, a man whose death I mourned, and the fact that my own country, the US, actually cooperated in his assassination even depresses me more. But regardless, I think that he had a really good take on Zionism. His argument was that the Palestinians did nothing to the Jews. In other words, the Holocaust did not occur in Palestine. The Holocaust occurred in Europe. Hitler was German. Now, was the Holocaust limited to Germany? No, but it was limited to Europe. And so why was Palestine chosen? Well, because there were many Jews who saw Israel, what is now Israel, what was then Palestine, as being the ancestral home of the Jewish people, neglecting the fact that there were already people living there now being 1940s. But regardless, when it looked like the UN was going to approve a new Israel in what was then Palestine, trucks run by Jews, presumably future Israelis, rolled into Palestine, flattened Palestinian homes, killed many Palestinians, and exiled many others into the occupied territories. And so it remains today. That has not changed. The offer was made in the 1940s to both the Palestinians and to the Jews that part of Palestine would be given to the Palestinians and part of it would be given to the Jews. Well, the Palestinians, I think, understandably objected because in the area that was being given to the Jews, Palestinians were already living. So that would mean that their homes would need to be demolished, which in fact is what happened. So the situation, in effect, got even worse for the Palestinians. But it showed at that time the callousness of the political Zionists. And at that time, there was a distinction between different types of Zionism. For example, political Zionism and cultural Zionism. Martin Buber, for example, the author of the famous book I and Thou, sometimes regarded as a Jewish existentialist, although I don't know if Buber himself would have accepted that appellation, but he was called that. I prefer to keep or reserve the term existentialism for Jean-Paul Sartre, since he's the one who coined the term. But regardless, whether Buber was an existentialist or not, he certainly was concerned with human existence and understanding it. And so I and Thou was a book which I've read, a wonderful book, which explores the relationship with God as a personal relationship. Now, the word thou no longer exists in the English language. You know, it's in French, the equivalent of thou is tu. Tu is the informal version of you in French. Vous is the formal version of you in French. These days in France, commonly, I guess as a result of the more general informalization of the world, especially of the West, tu has become more commonly used than vous in Francophone culture. But in the English language, thou, like tu, was simply eliminated. And so today we only see the word thou used in books like Shakespeare's volumes and the King James or authorized translation of the Old and New Testaments. Outside of that, and some other works written around that period, the word thou is no longer found. It's not used in contemporary or modern English. So what Buber was trying to do was to establish the relationship between human beings and God as an informal relationship, one which we could in which we could relate to God as a friend, not as a distant person or a distant being, not as someone who was completely out of contact with human life, but someone who was with us, the omnipresent God, meaning universally present. So although Buber was a monotheist, he believed in one God who had a relationship with humanity and with the world. He also believed in omnipresence. And so in that sense, you could argue that there was a bit of what is sometimes called panentheism in the views of Martin Buber. Pan means all, en is in, and then theism is a belief in God. So panentheism is a belief in God in all of us, or all of us in God. Sometimes the metaphor is used of God as the ocean, and all of us as fish swimming in the ocean of God. And I think that is a very apt way of viewing what panentheism is. Panentheism should not be confused with pantheism, which is the view that everything is God. So that they are two very different theologies. So Buber was a panentheist of a sort, but not a pantheist, but he was also a monotheist. Buber believed in cultural Zionism. That is to say, he believed that the culture of Jews, which again could be called Yiddishkeit, which is a Yiddish word, meaning kind of like Yiddishism, or basically the Yiddish way of life, the Jewish way of life, that should be preserved and that should be continued in some form. Exactly what that form would be could be debated. Buber never fully supported political Zionism, meaning he never really fully supported the idea of Israel as a distinct political entity. Buber had no hostility toward the Palestinians. He did not like the idea of the type of apartheid, for example, which now exists in Greater Palestine, where Israel is a single portion of Palestine, most of Palestine, and the rest of Palestine is reserved for the Palestinians, and arguably also some of it for the Jordanians. So Buber supported cultural Zionism. But that is not the type of Zionism which became popular. Instead, political Zionism became popular. And so today, when people use the term Zionism, they are generally referring to political Zionism, because cultural Zionism has kind of become antiquated. I mean, there really is no point anymore of talking about Jews as a distinct culture when there is already a Jewish state. Now, that could be argued because one of the largest countries with Jews in it is the US. And many American Jews actually resent Israel's attempt to equate Zionism exclusively with itself. That is a controversy which has never been fully resolved, but it has been mostly resolved in that the majority of American Jews are political Zionists. Most American Jews do support Israel. Are there some who do not? Yes, but the majority do. In fact, I personally only know one North American Jew who is an anti-Zionist, and he lives in Montreal, Canada. And because of his activities of writing graffiti on a Zionist board or poster, he is actually being charged with a felony in Canada. And Abraham Weisfeld, which is his name, who was a wonderful man, who is friends with the Palestinians, who knows many Palestinians, who travels into Israel. Why? Because, well, there is no airport anywhere in Palestine. So if you want to get into Palestine by air, you have to fly, for example, into Ben Gurion Airport and then get a cab or a coach bus from Ben Gurion Airport into Palestine. You can't fly into Palestine. So he has done that. He goes there on a regular basis, or has. Now he can't because of the pending felony charge against him. To me, that is completely absurd. I literally do not understand it. How can you charge somebody with a felony for graffiti, even with a misdemeanor? I've never heard of such a thing. Now, I'm not a Canadian. I don't know Canadian law, but for that matter, I don't know US law either that well. But the idea of being charged with a felony, which is the most serious crime person can be charged with and convicted of, just seems totally ludicrous to me. Maybe, maybe a civil charge. In that case, the person who owned the sign that was arguably defaced by Abraham Weisfeld could bring civil charges against Abraham. Even that seems like a stretch, but I suppose if somebody wanted to do that, they could. I mean, anybody can bring civil charges against anyone, theoretically. There's no reason why a person could not. I don't know Canadian law, so I will not continue beyond that point. I don't know exactly what for example, if there is a penalty for bringing frivolous charges in Canada. I have no idea, so I will remain silent on that issue. I will just say that I don't understand how in the world this guy could be charged with a felony for putting graffiti on a Zionist sign. But the reason, however illogical it is related to the power of Zionism in the Western world. I used to think that was only in the US, or at least predominantly in the US. I never thought that Zionism was as powerful as it is in Canada, but apparently it is. Apparently it is. Of course, in the US, we have AIPAC, which is a far right-wing Jewish organization which supports political Zionism without any hesitation at all. I believe there is a Canadian organization which is somewhat similar to AIPAC. I don't off the top of my head, and I speak extemporaneously, so I can't remember it, which is similar to AIPAC, but I can't name it because I don't generally think about this subject that much. It's not one of the more important issues for me. But Abraham is an important person to me. I don't know him that well. I only know him online, but what I do know of him is that he is a wonderful man with a splendid character who is devoted to justice, arguably to the ancient Jewish principle of tikkun ha'olam, which I have discussed previously in this podcast, which means repairing or fixing the world in Hebrew. The word olam is the Hebrew word for world. And Abraham is committed to that, as are a lot of Jews. But again, what is repairing or fixing the world? Some people could argue, for example, that Zionism, political Zionism, is repairing the world. So it's a nebulous concept, and its interpretation can vary depending upon the person who is writing or speaking. Now on to how that interfaces, in my view, with Maoism-Third Worldism. I think that from a Maoist Third Worldist perspective, the focus should be not on Israel, but on Palestine. That does not mean that the Israelis should be thrown to the lions or thrown to the wolves. I personally don't really care where they go. They can stay where they are. They can move to other places. But I would like to see, from the river to the sea, one country of Palestine, which would give back dignity to the Palestinians, which they've lost. They have lost that dignity, including in the eyes of the world. How much respect, for example, does Palestine receive from my own country, the United States? Basically none. Every time an anti-Israeli, anti-political Zionism resolution is introduced in the UN Security Council, in which the US, as well as a few other countries, have a veto, which means that it's as if there was not a motion in the first place. The US has vetoed it with only one or two exceptions. And consequently, the war which is now taking place by Israel against Hamas is allowed to continue because the United States basically opposes a truce, openly opposes a truce. Now, the official policy is that Israel should not be attacking hospitals, schools, places like that. But is Israel paying any attention to that? No. Has the United States forced Israel to face any consequences for ignoring U.S. Will? No. And so basically, it is like a slap on the wrist, or maybe a public relations gesture. There really is no accountability for the Israelis for what they have been doing against the Palestinians. So I think, as a Maoist Third Worldist, I think that we need to put the Palestinians at the center of our thoughts, using an intersectional Marxist perspective, which is part of what I use. We need to shift the center of our thinking and shift the center of our behavior away from Israel and toward Palestine, away from the first world and toward the third world, from a critical realist perspective, and especially from the perspective of the philosophy of meta-reality. If we look at the concept of co-presence, I think we need to ask, how is the Israeli war on Gaza leading to co-presence, leading to unity? producing any kind of civil or civilized community in that part of the world? I think the inescapable answer is not at all. And sadly, most Arab countries, maybe all, I don't know, I think most or all, appear not to care. Why? Well, one big reason is because of the business deals which have recently been reached between Israel and many Arab countries. And even though there is not officially a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that is only a technicality. For all intents and purposes, Israel has diplomatic and commercial relations with Saudi Arabia and has for a long time. The two countries are partners in crime, literally partners in crime. Both countries have engaged in exploitive activity. In the case of Israel, against Palestine. In the case of Saudi Arabia, against Yemen. Now, in the case of Israel, I think it is beyond dispute that Israel is engaging in colonialism, because Israel is a colonial power. For the most part, the residents of Israel are not native to that area. They are people who migrated there in the 1940s and since that time. It might be more difficult referring to what Saudi Arabia did to Yemen as colonialism, since both countries are Arab countries, and therefore both places could be considered as being indigenous. However, one could certainly argue that what Saudi Arabia did to Yemen was imperialistic. So whatever term you want to use, I don't really know. Does it really matter whether you call it colonialism, imperialism, or hegemony? Point is that you have countries with very little power, Yemen, Palestine, and many others throughout the world, who are being oppressed by first world countries. There is no co-presence. There is only demi-reality or disunity between the first world and the third world. And as Roy Bhaskar said, that when we see demi-reality, we need to destroy it and replace it with co-presence, replace it with unity, because demi-reality causes nothing but alienation. And alienation means that we are alienated from our nations, from our communities, from our families, and ultimately from ourselves. And we lose ourselves in the process of demi-reality. Embracing co-presence allows us to discover our true self. In fact, I would argue that the true self, or the higher self, for all of us is co-presence. We all share that same self. There is no such thing as my higher self and your higher self. There's only one higher self, which is co-presence. There's only one lower self, and that is demi-reality. And we are immersed globally in that condition. And so until we can escape from demi-reality, so as for example, until the world can escape from the first world, especially the third world can escape from the first world, as Palestine escaping from Israel's grasp, mighty grasp, supported by the greatest and strongest political power in world history, the United States. Until that happens, we will still be bound and chained into a world of demi-reality. And that is what saddens me the most. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.